The dust kicked up around Theresa Harper's boots as she stepped off the stagecoach in Trinity, Texas, and she could already feel the weight of curious eyes pressing against her like the oppressive July heat of 1882. She had learned long ago that being a widow at 23 invited speculation, but being a widow whose husband died in a saloon brawl over a card game invited something far worse. The driver handed down her trunk with barely concealed distaste, and Theresa pressed 2 coins into his palm without meeting his gaze. She had sold everything she owned in St. Louis to afford the journey west, chasing the promise of her late husband's brother, who had written that he could offer her honest work in his general store. It was either that, or face another winter of pitying looks and whispered accusations that somehow Robert's death had been her fault, as if she had been the one to deal the crooked hand. Trinity was smaller than she had expected, a collection of weathered buildings clustered along a single main street that stretched between the railroad depot and a white-painted church at the far end. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air thick and heavy. Theresa pulled her shawl closer, despite the heat, a habitual gesture of protection that did nothing to shield her from the stares of 2 women standing outside the mercantile. They wore respectable dresses with high collars, their hair pinned perfectly beneath their bonnets, and their eyes tracked Theresa with the precision of hunters sighting prey. One leaned close to whisper something to the other, and both sets of lips curved into expressions that held no warmth. Theresa lifted her chin and walked toward the store, her trunk dragging a trail through the dirt behind her. The interior of the mercantile offered blessed relief from the sun, though the air inside hung still and close. A man emerged from behind the counter, his features so similar to Robert's that Theresa's breath caught for a moment before she remembered that this was Edward Harper, not her dead husband returned to life. Mrs. Harper. Edward's greeting was formal, his handshake brief. "Your letter said you would arrive this week. I have prepared quarters for you above the store. Thank you for your generosity." Theresa kept her voice steady and professional. "I am ready to begin work whenever you require it." Edward's expression suggested he found something distasteful about the entire situation, but he nodded curtly. "Tomorrow will be soon enough. The room is up those stairs. There is a basin for washing." Theresa hauled her trunk up the narrow staircase to find a small room with a single window overlooking the street, a narrow bed, a washstand, and nothing else. It was more than she had expected, and less than she had hoped for, which seemed to summarize her entire life since Robert had died 18 months ago. She unpacked her few belongings, hung her 2 spare dresses on the pegs driven into the wall, and sat on the edge of the bed to watch the sun paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. Below, she could hear the sounds of Trinity settling into evening. Horses whinnied at the livery stable across the street. Someone laughed, the sound carrying on the warm breeze. A dog barked in the distance. Theresa pressed her hand against the window glass, still hot from the day's heat, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in coming here. The next morning, she woke before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing and the rumble of wagon wheels on the street below. She dressed carefully in her plainest work dress, pinned her dark hair into a severe knot at the base of her neck, and descended to find Edward already behind the counter, making notations in a leather-bound ledger. "You will mind the counter while I make deliveries," he said without preamble. "Prices are marked. Do not extend credit to anyone without consulting me first. Mrs. Patterson will likely come in for flour. She always tries to negotiate. Do not let her." Theresa nodded and took her position behind the wooden counter, its surface worn smooth by years of transactions. Edward departed with barely another word, leaving her alone in the dim morning light filtering through the front windows. She busied herself with learning the layout of the store, noting where Edward kept the tinned goods, the bolts of fabric, the tools and hardware, the sacks of flour and sugar and coffee. The bell above the door chimed at 7:30, and the two women Theresa had seen the previous day entered together. They moved through the store with the confidence of regular customers, selecting items and bringing them to the counter where Theresa waited. "You must be the new widow." The taller of the two women spoke the word as if it were something shameful. "I am Mrs. Cordelia Winters, and this is Mrs. Evangeline Sutton. We heard about your arrival. Good morning." Theresa kept her voice neutral as she began tallying their purchases. "Will this be everything?" "We also heard about your husband." Mrs. Sutton leaned forward conspiratorially, though her voice remained loud enough to carry. "Gambling and drinking himself into an early grave. Such a tragedy when a man cannot control his vices." Theresa's hand stilled for only a moment before she continued her work. "That will be $4.35, and leaving you all alone, without children or prospects." Mrs. Winters shook her head with exaggerated sympathy. "One does wonder what kind of wife cannot keep her husband on the righteous path." The implication hung in the air between them, as clear as if Mrs. Winters had spoken it plainly. Theresa wrapped their purchases in brown paper with careful precision, tied the bundle with twine, and named the price again. Mrs. Winters paid with obvious reluctance, and both women departed with their heads close together, already whispering. The pattern repeated itself throughout the morning. Customers came and went, and nearly all of them found some excuse to mention Theresa's widowhood, her youth, her husband's reputation, the suspicious nature of her arrival in Trinity without family or friends. By noon, Theresa's jaw ached from clenching her teeth, and her eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. She was arranging a display of preserves when the bell chimed again, and a different quality of silence filled the store. Theresa turned to find a tall man standing just inside the doorway, his hat in his hands, his eyes the color of a summer sky. He wore dusty work clothes and boots that had seen hard use, and something about the way he carried himself suggested capability and quiet strength. "Madam." He nodded respectfully. "I need supplies for the trail, heading out to move cattle up from the southern pastures." Theresa found her voice after a moment. "Of course. What do you require?" He rattled off a list of items: coffee and flour and dried beans and salt pork, and Theresa gathered them efficiently while he waited by the counter. She could feel him watching her, but his gaze held none of the judgmental weight she had endured all morning. When she presented him with the total, he paid without complaint and began loading his purchases into a canvas sack. "You are new to Trinity." It was a statement rather than a question. "I arrived yesterday." Theresa kept her hands busy straightening items on the counter that did not need straightening. "I am Mrs. Harper, the proprietor's sister-in-law, Grant Dalton." He extended his hand across the counter, and after a moment's hesitation, Theresa shook it. His grip was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who worked with his body. "I run cattle on the Bar D Ranch, about 10 miles northeast of town. It is nice to meet you, Mr. Dalton. Grant." He settled his hat back on his head, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. "I hope Trinity treats you well, Mrs. Harper." She did not know how to respond to that kindness, so she simply nodded. Grant Dalton touched the brim of his hat in farewell and departed, leaving the store feeling somehow larger and emptier than it had before his arrival. Edward returned in the afternoon with an expression that suggested his deliveries had not gone smoothly. He counted the money in the cash box, compared it to the notations Theresa had made, and grunted what might have been approval before disappearing into the back room. Theresa remained at the counter until closing time, watching the street outside grow quiet as Trinity settled into evening. Over the following days, Theresa established a routine that kept her busy enough to ignore the loneliness that threatened to swallow her whole. She rose early, worked in the store until Edward closed for the evening, and retreated to her small room where she mended her clothes and read the few books she had brought from St. Louis. The whispers followed her everywhere, a constant undercurrent to her daily life. She overheard Mrs. Winters telling the postmaster that Theresa had probably driven her husband to drink with her cold nature. Mrs. Sutton informed anyone who would listen that it was suspicious how quickly Theresa had left St. Louis, as if she had been running from something worse than grief. Another woman, whose name Theresa never learned, speculated loudly in the street that Robert Harper had likely taken his own life to escape an unhappy marriage. Each whispered accusation felt like a small cut, and Theresa bore them in silence because she had learned long ago that defending herself only made things worse. People believed what they wanted to believe, and a young widow without protection was an easy target for judgment and speculation. 2 weeks after her arrival in Trinity, Theresa was closing the store for the evening when she heard raised voices outside. She peered through the window to see a group of women gathered near the church, their faces animated with gossip. Mrs. Winters stood at the center, her voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "I am telling you there is something wrong about that woman. She never goes to church on Sundays. She barely speaks to anyone. What kind of decent woman lives like that? Perhaps she is mourning." This voice was quieter, uncertain. "Mourning?" Mrs. Sutton laughed sharply. "She has been here 2 weeks and I have never seen her shed a tear. If you ask me, she is relieved to be rid of her husband. Probably was unfaithful to him. That would explain why he spent so much time in saloons." Theresa stepped back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The accusations were growing worse, more inventive, more damaging. She had done nothing to deserve this treatment except have the misfortune of being widowed young and having no family to defend her reputation. She was still standing frozen in the middle of the store when she heard boots on the wooden sidewalk outside, followed by the low rumble of a male voice. "Evening, ladies." Theresa recognized Grant Dalton's voice instantly. She moved back to the window, staying in the shadows where she could observe without being seen. Grant stood facing the group of women, his posture relaxed but his expression serious. He had removed his hat, holding it in one hand while the other rested casually on his belt. The women had fallen silent at his approach, their gossiping circle broken by his presence. "Mr. Dalton." Mrs. Winters recovered first, her smile tight. "We were just discussing the new arrival in town." "I heard." Grant's tone was mild, conversational. "Sounded like you were discussing Mrs. Harper specifically." "We were merely expressing concern." Mrs. Sutton lifted her chin defensively. "A young woman alone with such a questionable past. Someone should speak to Reverend Matthews about it." "Questionable past." Grant repeated the words slowly as if tasting them. "That is interesting, seeing as how I knew Robert Harper. Played cards with him a few times when he came through Texas before he married. He was a drunk and a cheat who could not keep his temper under control. Got himself killed because he accused the wrong man of dealing from the bottom of the deck." The women shifted uncomfortably, but Mrs. Winters was not ready to concede. "That may be true, but what kind of wife lets her husband stray so far from decency? The kind who probably tried everything in her power to save a man who did not want saving." Grant's voice hardened slightly. "I have known a lot of drunks in my time, and not one of them quit because someone else wanted them to. Robert Harper's death was his own doing, and putting that blame on his widow is about the cruelest thing I can imagine. We are simply concerned about the moral character of someone living in our town." Mrs. Sutton's face had flushed red. Her moral character. Grant settled his hat back on his head, the gesture somehow final. "Here is what I know about Mrs. Harper's moral character. She works hard. She minds her own business. She treats everyone with courtesy even when they do not return the favor, and she has done nothing to deserve being talked about like she is some kind of criminal." "Mr. Dalton, I hardly think. I am not finished." Grant's voice cut through Mrs. Winters's protest. "From now on, if I hear anyone spreading rumors about Mrs. Harper, I am going to assume they are doing it out of boredom or meanness, and I am going to make sure everyone else in Trinity knows it too. That woman lost her husband, left everything she knew, and came here to start over. The least we can do is let her do it in peace." He touched the brim of his hat. "Ladies, I suggest you find something more productive to do with your time than tearing down someone who has never done you any harm." Grant turned and walked away, his boots ringing against the wooden sidewalk. The group of women scattered quickly, their whispers taking on a different quality now, defensive rather than gleeful. Theresa remained by the window, her hand pressed against her throat where her pulse hammered. She had not asked Grant Dalton to defend her. She barely knew him. Yet he had stood up to the very women who held social power in Trinity, and told them plainly that their behavior was wrong. She did not see him again for several days, and she found herself watching for him with an anticipation she tried not to examine too closely. The whispers in town had not stopped entirely, but they had grown more circumspect, confined to lowered voices and knowing glances rather than open speculation. The following Sunday, Theresa surprised herself by dressing in her best dress and walking to the white church at the end of the main street. She had avoided services since arriving in Trinity, partly because she was exhausted by the time Sunday arrived, and partly because she knew she would face judgment there. But Grant's defense had given her something she had not felt in months: courage. The interior of the church was simple and clean, with wooden pews arranged in neat rows and sunlight streaming through plain glass windows. Theresa slipped into a pew near the back, aware of the heads turning to mark her presence. She kept her eyes forward and her hands folded in her lap, listening to Reverend Matthews deliver a sermon about forgiveness and compassion that seemed almost pointed given recent events. After the service, several people made a point of introducing themselves with varying degrees of warmth. An elderly couple welcomed her kindly. A young mother with a baby on her hip smiled and said she hoped Theresa was settling in well. Mrs. Winters and Mrs. Sutton kept their distance, their expressions suggesting they had not forgiven Grant's public rebuke. Theresa was preparing to slip away when she heard a familiar voice behind her: Mrs. Harper. She turned to find Grant Dalton standing in the churchyard, dressed in clean clothes that showed he had made an effort for the service. His hair was still damp, as if he had bathed in the creek before coming to town. "Mr. Dalton." Theresa felt suddenly shy, aware that they had never actually discussed his defense of her reputation. "I did not expect to see you here. I do not make it to services as often as I should. The ranch keeps me busy." He fell into step beside her as she began walking back toward the mercantile. "But I heard you might be attending today, and I wanted to make sure you knew you had at least one friendly face in the congregation." "That was kind of you." Theresa kept her eyes on the dusty street. "As was what you said to those women last week. I was in the store, I heard." Grant was quiet for a moment. "I meant every word. You deserve better than the way they have been treating you. You barely know me. I know enough." He stopped walking, and Theresa stopped too, turning to face him. The Sunday morning sun painted everything in golden light, and Grant's eyes were very blue. I know you work hard. I know you keep your dignity even when people try to take it from you. I know your husband was a fool who did not appreciate what he had. Theresa's breath caught. You should not say such things. Why not? Because it is improper to speak honestly. Grant smiled slightly. I have never been very good at saying what people expect me to say, Mrs. Harper. I prefer the truth. The truth is complicated. Most things worth knowing are. He studied her face for a long moment. Would you allow me to call on you, properly, I mean, with your permission and in a way that would not damage your reputation further? Theresa's heart hammered against her ribs. She had not expected this, had not allowed herself to even imagine that someone like Grant Dalton might be interested in her company. I do not think that would be wise. People already talk about me enough. Let them talk. I stopped caring what small-minded people think a long time ago. Grant's expression was serious now. But I care what you think, and if you do not want my attention, I will respect that and leave you in peace. She should say no. Every practical part of her brain screamed that she should thank him politely and walk away, that she had no business even considering the possibility of another relationship when her husband had been dead less than 2 years. But standing there in the Sunday morning sunshine, looking up at Grant Dalton's honest face, Theresa found herself saying something different. I would not object to you calling on me, if you truly wish to. The smile that broke across Grant's face was worth every bit of gossip it would surely generate. Then I will come by the store on Wednesday evening if that suits you. Perhaps we could take a walk before dinner. Wednesday evening would be acceptable. They stood there for another moment, neither quite ready to break the spell of the conversation, before Grant touched his hat and excused himself. Theresa watched him walk toward the livery stable, his stride long and easy, and tried to ignore the flutter of something that felt dangerously like hope in her chest. The week crawled by with agonizing slowness. Theresa worked in the store, enduring Edward's silent disapproval and the continued whispers from customers. But Wednesday evening glowed on the horizon like a promise. She found herself thinking about Grant at odd moments, remembering the way he had defended her, the steadiness in his voice, the respect in his eyes. On Tuesday afternoon, Mrs. Winters came into the store with Mrs. Sutton in tow, both women wearing expressions of barely concealed triumph. Mrs. Harper. Mrs. Winters's voice dripped false sweetness. We heard that Mr. Dalton plans to call on you tomorrow evening. How quickly you have moved on from your dear departed husband. Theresa kept her hand steady as she measured out the flour Mrs. Winters had requested. Mr. Dalton is a gentleman who has shown me kindness. I see no harm in his company. No harm. Mrs. Sutton laughed. Mark my words, a woman like you will only bring that good man trouble. He deserves someone with an unblemished reputation, not a widow with questions hanging over her. Is there anything else you need today? Theresa kept her voice level through sheer force of will. Mrs. Winters leaned forward, her eyes hard. You may have fooled Grant Dalton with your helpless widow act, but we know what you really are. A woman who could not keep her husband alive, much less happy. You will do the same to Grant if given the chance. Something inside Theresa finally broke. She had endured weeks of whispers and accusations, had borne judgment from women who knew nothing about her life or her marriage, and she could not carry it any more. You know nothing about me. Her voice came out low and fierce. You know nothing about my marriage or what I endured. Robert Harper was drinking before I married him, and he kept drinking after. I tried everything I knew to help him, and he repaid me by spending our money on cards and whiskey and leaving me destitute when he died. I came to Trinity because I had nowhere else to go, and I have worked hard and bothered no one. If that is not good enough for you, then I suggest you take your business elsewhere. The store fell silent. Mrs. Winters and Mrs. Sutton stared at her with identical expressions of shock, as if they had never expected the meek widow to fight back. Well, Mrs. Winters gathered her packages with sharp movements. I can see that your true nature is finally showing itself. Come along, Evangeline. We do not need to subject ourselves to this kind of treatment. They swept out of the store, the bell above the door chiming violently. Theresa stood behind the counter, shaking with the aftermath of confrontation, half expecting Edward to emerge from the back room and dismiss her for driving away customers. Instead, she heard the sound of slow clapping. Edward stood in the doorway to the back room, his expression unreadable. I have been waiting 2 weeks for you to stand up to those harpies. Well done. Theresa blinked in surprise. I thought you would be angry. Angry. Those women have been making everyone miserable with their gossip for years. Someone needed to tell them the truth. Edward almost smiled. Robert was my brother and I loved him, but he was a drunk and a fool. You tried to save him and it cost you everything. Anyone with eyes could see that. It was the most words Edward had spoken to her since her arrival, and Theresa found her eyes burning with tears. Thank you for saying so. It needed saying. Edward returned to his work, the moment of connection already fading back into his usual reserve. But it was enough. Wednesday evening arrived with agonizing slowness. Theresa changed into her better dress after the store closed, one that Robert had bought her during the early days of their marriage when he still tried to pretend he could control his drinking. It was a soft blue cotton with tiny buttons up the front, and she had kept it carefully packed away for special occasions. She was pinning up her hair when she heard boots on the stairs, followed by a knock on her door. Mrs. Harper, there is someone here to see you. Edward's voice held something that might have been amusement. Theresa descended to find Grant waiting by the counter, his hat in his hands and his expression nervous in a way that made her heart squeeze. He wore clean clothes and had clearly taken care with his appearance, and he smiled when he saw her. You look lovely. Thank you. Theresa collected her shawl, suddenly feeling like a girl again rather than a world-weary widow. Shall we walk? They stepped out into the warm evening air, and Grant offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. Theresa took it, feeling the solid muscle beneath his sleeve, and they began walking slowly down the main street. I heard about what happened yesterday with Mrs. Winters, Grant said after a moment. News travels fast in a small town. I imagine I made things worse for myself. Theresa watched the dust curl around their feet, but I could not stay silent anymore. Good. You should not have to. Grant's voice was firm. Those women have been poisoning this town with their judgments for too long. Maybe your honesty will make them think twice before attacking someone else. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, leaving the main street behind to follow a path that led toward the creek. The evening was still hot but beginning to cool, and the sound of water over rocks provided a peaceful counterpoint to their footsteps. Tell me about the ranch, Theresa said eventually. How did you come to own it? My father started the Bar D 20 years ago when this was still dangerous country. He ran cattle and fought off rustlers and somehow managed to build something lasting. Grant's expression turned distant with memory. He died 3 years ago. Left the ranch to me and my sister, though Rachel married a banker in Dallas and signed over her share. So now it is just me and 5 hired hands trying to keep 1,000 head of cattle fed and healthy. That sounds like hard work. It is the only work I have ever wanted to do. Grant smiled. There is something satisfying about it. You start the day with a list of problems and you solve them one at a time. Fix a fence. Move the herd to better grazing. Break a new horse. At the end of the day, you can see what you accomplished. I envy that. Theresa's voice came out softer than she intended. My life in St. Louis felt like I was running in circles. Nothing ever changed, except Robert got worse and our debts got bigger. You do not have to talk about it if it is painful. No, I want to. She took a breath, surprised by how true it was. I married Robert when I was 19. He was handsome and charming, and he promised me a good life. I did not know about his drinking until after the wedding. At first it was just an occasional excess, something I thought I could manage. But it got worse. He could not hold a job. He spent our money on cards. He stayed out all night in saloons. Grant was quiet, letting her speak at her own pace. I tried everything. I begged him to stop. I hid the money. I talked to his friends, to his family, to our minister. Nothing worked. And eventually I realized that I could not save someone who did not want to be saved. Theresa's throat tightened. When he died, I felt terrible grief mixed with terrible relief, and I have hated myself for that relief ever since. You should not hate yourself for surviving, Grant said quietly. That is what you did, Theresa. You survived something hard and came out the other side. There is no shame in that. It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his voice felt intimate and right. Thank you for understanding. They had reached the creek, where water ran clear and shallow over smooth stones. Cottonwood trees grew along the banks, their leaves rustling in the evening breeze. Grant led Theresa to a flat rock near the water's edge, and they sat together watching the light fade from the sky. I want to be honest with you about something, Grant said after a while. I am 30 years old and I have never been married. I came close once, about 5 years back. Her name was Catherine. She was beautiful and educated, daughter of a wealthy family in Austin. We courted for 6 months, and I was ready to propose. Theresa heard the pain in his voice and waited for him to continue. But then she came to visit the ranch, saw what my life really was, the hard work and the isolation and the dust and the cattle. She told me she had thought I would eventually move to a city, become something more respectable. Grant picked up a pebble and tossed it into the creek. She said she could not marry a man who was content to remain a rancher his whole life. She was a fool. Grant looked at her in surprise, then laughed. Maybe, but it taught me something important. I am who I am, and I will not pretend to be someone different to please a woman. The ranch is my life. If that is not enough, then we are not meant to be together. I think any woman would be lucky to share that life with you. Theresa meant it with her whole heart. You have built something real and lasting. That is more than most people can say. Grant reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. I want to keep seeing you, Theresa. I want to know everything about you. I want to see if this feeling between us is something that could grow into something permanent. Theresa's heart hammered against her ribs. I want that too, but you need to know that people will talk. They will say terrible things. I do not want you to lose respect in this community because of me. I do not care what people say. Grant squeezed her hand gently. I care about you. That is enough. They sat by the creek until the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, talking about everything and nothing, learning the shapes of each other's histories and dreams. When Grant finally walked Theresa back to the mercantile, he kissed her hand at the door with a formality that made her feel cherished rather than merely wanted. May I see you again on Saturday? He asked. Yes, I would like that very much. Theresa climbed the stairs to her small room with her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. She lay in bed watching the stars through her window and let herself imagine a future that held more than just survival. Grant came to see her every few days over the following weeks, fitting his visits around the endless work of the ranch. Sometimes they walked by the creek. Sometimes they sat on the porch behind the mercantile and talked until the stars came out. Sometimes Grant brought his guitar and played soft melodies while Theresa listened, her heart full of a feeling she was almost afraid to name. The whispers in town continued, but their nature changed. Some people still disapproved, but others began to defend Theresa, pointing out that she had done nothing wrong and that Grant Dalton was old enough to make his own choices. A few women even made tentative overtures of friendship, inviting Theresa to join the church quilting circle or offering advice on the best places to shop in Trinity. Mrs. Winters and Mrs. Sutton remained coldly hostile, but Theresa found she could endure their judgment more easily now that she had Grant's support and the backing of kinder townspeople. She held her head high and did her work, and allowed herself to believe that she might actually build a good life in Trinity. On a Saturday evening in late September, Grant invited Theresa to visit the Bar D Ranch. He arrived in town driving a wagon, and he helped her up onto the seat with careful hands before setting the horses into motion. The land outside Trinity was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, all rolling plains and scattered mesquite trees beneath a sky so huge it made Theresa feel small in the best possible way. Grant pointed out landmarks as they drove, explaining the boundaries of his property and the challenges of running cattle in country that could be merciless one season and generous the next. The ranch house sat in a small hollow protected from the worst winds, a sturdy structure of weathered wood with a wide porch and real glass windows. Grant helped Theresa down from the wagon and led her inside, his nervousness showing in the way he straightened things that did not need straightening. "It is not fancy," he apologized, "but it is comfortable." Theresa looked around at the main room with its stone fireplace and handmade furniture, the kitchen with its cast iron stove and scrubbed table, the shelves lined with books, and she felt something settle in her chest. "It is perfect," she said honestly. "It feels like a real home." Grant's smile was worth the words. He showed her the rest of the house, the 2 bedrooms and the small office where he kept his accounts, and then they walked outside to watch the sunset from the porch. "I am going to ask you something," Grant said quietly, "and I want you to answer honestly, even if you think it might hurt my feelings." Theresa's heart began to race. "All right. Could you be happy here, living this kind of life?" "It is hard work and long days, and sometimes it feels like the land is trying to break you. There are no theaters or fancy shops or society gatherings, just cattle and horses and the sky." Theresa looked out at the vast landscape, painted in shades of gold and purple by the setting sun, and she thought about her life in St. Louis with its suffocating propriety and whispered judgments. She thought about the endless cycle of trying to manage Robert's drinking while pretending everything was fine. She thought about the cold loneliness that had followed her like a shadow. "I could be happy here," she said. "I think I could be happier here than anywhere else I have ever been." Grant turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Then I need to tell you something else. I am in love with you, Theresa Harper. I have been falling in love with you since the day I first saw you in the Mercantile, looking so brave despite everything those women were saying. I love your strength and your honesty and the way you keep going even when things are hard. I love the sound of your laugh and the way you listen when I talk about the ranch. I love everything about you, and I want you to be my wife." Theresa's eyes filled with tears, but for once they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too. I did not think I would ever feel this way about anyone, but you have shown me what it means to be truly seen and valued. Yes, Grant. Yes, I will marry you." Grant pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a kiss that held all the promise of the future they would build together. Theresa melted into him, feeling safe and cherished and completely herself for the first time in her adult life. They were married 6 weeks later in the white church at the end of Trinity's Main Street. Theresa wore a new dress that Grant had insisted on buying for her, pale green silk with lace at the collar, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Grant had ridden out before dawn to pick himself. The church was packed with townspeople, some genuinely happy for them and others simply curious to witness the unlikely union. Edward gave Theresa away with a gruff kindness that surprised her, and Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with obvious pleasure. When Grant kissed his bride, the congregation erupted in applause, and even Mrs. Winters had to paste on a smile and offer perfunctory congratulations. The wedding breakfast was held at the hotel, with food donated by various townspeople who had decided to embrace the match. Grant's ranch hands attended, all of them grinning at their boss's obvious happiness. The elderly couple who had welcomed Theresa at church toasted the newlyweds with genuine warmth. Even some of the women who had whispered about Theresa came to wish her well, their earlier judgment apparently forgotten or forgiven. As the sun began to set, Grant and Theresa climbed into the wagon for the ride back to the Bar D. Theresa had already moved her few belongings to the ranch house, and as they drove through the gathering dusk, she felt as if she were finally traveling toward home rather than away from pain. The first months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Theresa had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, waking before dawn to cook breakfast for Grant and the hands, mastering the cast iron stove and the temperamental pump in the kitchen, learning to bake bread that did not turn out like rocks. Grant was endlessly patient with her mistakes, praising her small successes, and never complaining when the biscuits burned or the gravy turned lumpy. In return, Theresa threw herself into making the house a real home. She sewed curtains for the windows and pieced together a quilt for their bed. She planted a vegetable garden near the house and coaxed tomatoes and beans and squash from the stubborn soil. She learned to distinguish between the different cattle calls and what they meant, how to tell when a horse was going lame, when to expect the supply wagon from town. The work was hard but satisfying in a way her life in St. Louis had never been. At the end of each day, Theresa could see what she had accomplished: clean laundry snapping on the line, bread cooling on the counter, a mended shirt hanging on the peg. And most importantly, Grant's face lighting up when he came in from the range and found her waiting for him. Their physical relationship unfolded slowly, both of them learning what brought the other pleasure. Grant was patient and gentle, always asking what she wanted, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. Theresa had spent her first marriage trying to please a man who was often too drunk to notice her efforts, and discovering what it meant to be with someone who truly cared about her happiness was a revelation. On a cold December night, wrapped in quilts and listening to the wind howl outside, Theresa told Grant about the worst of her marriage to Robert, the times he had come home violent with drink, the day she had found bruises on her arms that she could not remember getting, the humiliation of having shopkeepers refuse her credit because Robert had not paid his debts, the night she had seriously considered leaving everything behind and boarding a train to anywhere else. Grant held her through the telling, his arms strong and safe around her. When she finished, he kissed her forehead and promised that he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never felt that kind of fear or desperation again. "You are not responsible for what Robert did," he told her firmly. "You tried to help him, and he refused your help. That is on him, not you, and anyone who judges you for his failures is a fool. I wasted so many years on him." "No." Grant tipped her face up to meet his eyes. "You survived. That is not wasting time. That is incredible strength. And everything you endured brought you here to me, to this life. I would not change a single moment if it meant losing you." Winter passed slowly, with cold winds and occasional snow that transformed the harsh landscape into something magical. Theresa learned to make stew that could feed 5 hungry ranch hands and still have leftovers. She learned to recognize the signs that a storm was coming and to make sure the chickens were locked up safe before the wind hit. She learned that Grant sang to himself when he thought no one was listening, old folk songs his mother had taught him. In February, Theresa missed her monthly courses and felt the first flutterings of nausea in the mornings. She waited another week to be certain before telling Grant, catching him alone in the barn one evening while he was tending to his favorite horse. "I think I am pregnant." Grant went very still, his hand frozen on the horse's flank. Then he turned to face her, his expression transforming into pure joy. "Truly, I believe so. It is early yet, but all the signs are there." Grant crossed the barn in 3 long strides and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop before she was sick. He set her down carefully, his hands framing her face, his eyes bright with tears. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes." Theresa felt her own tears spilling over. "We are going to have a baby." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring. Theresa's stomach rounded slowly, and she felt the first kicks in April, like butterflies fluttering against her insides. Grant was attentive to the point of being comical, insisting she rest more, forbidding her from lifting anything heavy, bringing her wildflowers and treats from town to make her smile. The women of Trinity, sensing an opportunity to mend fences, began stopping by the ranch with gifts and advice. Some of it was useful, explaining how to prepare for the birth and what supplies she would need. Some of it was contradictory nonsense about eating certain foods to ensure a boy or sleeping on her left side to prevent the baby from being born with a birthmark. Even Mrs. Winters unbent enough to donate a basket of baby clothes that her own children had outgrown, though she could not resist adding, "I hope you will be a better mother than you were a wife." Theresa took the clothes and thanked her politely, refusing to let the barbed comment ruin her happiness. Grant was less diplomatic when she told him about it later, saying he was half tempted to ride into town and give Mrs. Winters a piece of his mind, but Theresa talked him out of it. "She is a bitter woman who cannot stand to see others happy," Theresa said. "The best revenge is living well, which we are doing beautifully." Their son was born in early October, just as the weather began to turn cool and the leaves on the cottonwoods turned gold. The labor was long and difficult, with Grant pacing anxiously outside the bedroom while the midwife and 2 neighbor women attended Theresa. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Grant was allowed in to meet his son. "He is beautiful," Grant whispered, staring down at the tiny bundle in Theresa's arms. "He looks like you." "He has your eyes," Theresa countered, studying the baby's face with wonder, "and your stubborn chin." They named him Thomas, after Grant's father, and the baby transformed their lives in ways both exhausting and marvelous. Theresa learned to function on broken sleep, to nurse the baby while managing household chores, to decode the different cries that meant hungry versus tired versus uncomfortable. Grant proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Thomas when he fussed at night, singing him the same folk songs his own mother had sung. The first year of Thomas's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles. His first smile, his first laugh. The day he rolled over on his own. The moment he said something that sounded almost like Papa, and Grant's face lit up like the sun. Through it all, Theresa's love for Grant only deepened. She watched him with their son and saw a gentleness that made her heart ache. She saw how hard he worked to provide for them, riding out before dawn and coming home after dark during the busy seasons. She saw how he looked at her, even when she was exhausted and covered in spit-up, like she was the most precious thing in his world. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she told him one evening after Thomas had finally fallen asleep. They sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Neither did I." Grant pulled her close against his side. "I thought I would live out my life alone, married to the ranch. And then you walked into the mercantile looking so fierce and brave, and everything changed. I was terrified that day. I know. That is what made you so brave." Grant kissed the top of her head. "You were terrified and you kept going anyway. You have always been the strongest person I know, Theresa." She tilted her face up to kiss him properly, a long, slow kiss that held all the love and gratitude she could not always put into words. When they finally pulled apart, Grant was smiling. "We should have another baby," he said. "Thomas needs a brother or sister to keep him company." "Let me recover from this one first," Theresa laughed. "But yes, I would like that. A whole house full of children if we are blessed." They were indeed blessed. 2 years after Thomas's birth, Theresa delivered a daughter they named Catherine, with dark hair like her mother and a sunny disposition that made everyone who met her smile. 3 years after that came another son, James, who entered the world howling his displeasure and barely stopped for the first 6 months. The ranch prospered under Grant's management. He expanded the herd, bought more land, hired additional hands to help with the work. Theresa managed the household with capable efficiency, raising their children while still finding time to maintain her garden and help with the ranch accounts. Together they built something lasting and real, a legacy they could pass on to their children. Theresa occasionally went into Trinity for supplies, and she noticed that the whispers had finally stopped. She was no longer the scandalous widow with the questionable past. She was Mrs. Grant Dalton, respected rancher's wife and mother of 3. Some of the same women who had once gossiped about her now sought her advice on raising children or managing households. Mrs. Winters remained frosty but civil, apparently having accepted that Theresa was a permanent fixture in Trinity society whether she approved or not. Mrs. Sutton had moved away to live with a daughter in Dallas, taking her sharp tongue with her. The elderly couple who had first welcomed Theresa to church had become like grandparents to her children, always ready with peppermints and stories. On a warm spring evening when Thomas was 7 and helping his father with the horses, Catherine was 5 and playing with her dolls, and baby James was finally sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Theresa stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked out at the land she now called home. She thought about the frightened widow who had stepped off the stagecoach in Trinity 5 years ago, carrying all her worldly possessions in a single trunk and expecting nothing but more judgment and hardship. She thought about the whispers and the accusations and the dark days when she had wondered if she would ever feel truly safe again. And then she thought about Grant, about the way he had defended her when she could not defend herself, about how he had seen past the gossip to the real person underneath. She thought about their children, healthy and happy and loved. She thought about this life they had built together, full of hard work and simple pleasures and deep contentment. Grant came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything. Nothing. How lucky I am." Theresa leaned into his embrace. "How different my life could have been if you had not walked into the mercantile that day." "I am the lucky one," Grant's voice rumbled in her ear. "I was just existing before you came along. You taught me what it means to really live. We taught each other." Theresa turned in his arms to face him. "That is what marriage is supposed to be, I think. 2 people making each other better, building something together that neither could build alone." Grant kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promise, and Theresa kissed him back with all the love in her heart. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "Come to bed," Grant murmured. "The children are settled and I want my wife to myself for a while." Greedy man. "Always. When it comes to you, I will always want more." They went inside together, closing the door on the starlit night, and Theresa felt nothing but gratitude for the life she had been given. The whispers that had once threatened to destroy her had faded into irrelevance. What mattered was this: the family she had built with Grant, the home they had created together, the love that grew stronger with every passing year. The years continued to unfold in a pattern of seasons and small miracles. Thomas grew tall and serious, helping his father with the ranch work and showing an aptitude for handling horses that made Grant swell with pride. Catherine remained sunny and social, making friends with every child in Trinity, and somehow charming even the crustiest old-timers. James developed into a rambunctious handful, always climbing things he should not climb and asking questions faster than anyone could answer them. When Thomas was 10, Grant began teaching him the business side of ranching, showing him how to keep the accounts and calculate fair prices and plan for the future. The boy took to it naturally, his young face serious as he absorbed his father's lessons. "He will make a fine rancher someday," Grant told Theresa one evening. "Better than me, probably. He has your head for figures." "He has your determination," Theresa countered, "and your integrity. Those matter more than being good with numbers." They were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching their children play in the yard while the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a scene that had repeated itself countless times over the years, and Theresa never tired of it. "You ever regret it?" Grant asked suddenly. "Giving up city life for this?" Theresa looked at him in surprise. "Never, not once. Why would you ask that? I know it is not the life you were raised for. No servants, no society, no fine things, just hard work and dust and cattle. Grant Dalton, you listen to me." Theresa took his hand firmly. "I would choose this life 1,000 times over. I would choose you 1,000 times over. Everything I have here, everything I am now, is because you saw me when no one else would. You defended me when no one else did. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable. This life, this family, this is everything I ever wanted but never knew how to ask for." Grant's eyes were suspiciously bright. "I love you more than words can say. I know, I feel the same way about you." Theresa squeezed his hand. "We are lucky, Grant, luckier than most people ever get to be. We found each other against all odds and we built something real. That is worth more than all the fine things in the world." As if to emphasize her point, James came running up to the porch at full speed, nearly tripping over his own feet in his excitement. "Papa, Papa, come see. Catherine and me found a turtle by the creek. Can we keep it? Please." Grant laughed and allowed himself to be dragged off the porch by his youngest son, with Catherine and Thomas trailing behind to advocate for the turtle's adoption. Theresa watched them go, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This was her life now. Not perfect because life was never perfect, but good and real and filled with love. The whispers that had once threatened to break her had instead forced her toward the greatest blessing she had ever known. When Grant returned to the porch an hour later, having negotiated a compromise where the turtle could stay for 1 week, before being returned to the creek, he found Theresa writing in the journal she had kept since their wedding day. "Recording the turtle negotiations for posterity," he teased. "Recording everything," Theresa said. "I want our children to know their story someday, how we met, how you defended me when others would not, how we built this life together. I want them to understand that love is not always easy or simple, but it is always worth fighting for." Grant sat beside her and read over her shoulder, his arms coming around her waist. "You make it sound like a fairy tale. It is better than a fairy tale. It is real." Theresa leaned back against him. "Fairy tales end with the wedding. Real love is everything that comes after." As the sun set over the Texas plains and their children's laughter echoed in the gathering dusk, Theresa Harper Dalton closed her journal and allowed herself to simply be present in the moment. She had survived heartbreak and loss, judgment and whispers, fear and desperation. And she had emerged on the other side stronger and happier than she had ever imagined possible. The cowboy had told them all to keep her name clean, and in doing so, he had given her back her dignity and her hope. But more than that, he had given her a love that transformed everything, a partnership that made every day better than the last, a family that filled her heart to overflowing. Years later, when Thomas was preparing to take over the ranch, and Catherine was planning her wedding to a young doctor from San Antonio and James was finishing school in town, Theresa would look back on that frightened widow stepping off the stagecoach in Trinity and barely recognize herself. She had been so lost then, so certain that her life was over before it had truly begun. She had not known that salvation could come in the form of a cowboy with kind eyes and a stubborn sense of justice. She had not known that defending someone's name could be the first step toward loving them completely. But she knew it now. She lived it every day. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Grant surprised Theresa by taking her back to the creek where they had sat on their first real date. The cottonwood trees were larger now, their branches spreading wide over the water. The rock where they had sat was still there, worn smooth by weather and time. Grant spread a blanket on the grass and unpacked a basket of food he had somehow prepared without her knowledge. They ate and talked and watched the water flow past, just as they had done 2 decades earlier when they were still learning the shapes of each other's hearts. "You remember what I told you that first evening?" Grant asked. "You told me a lot of things. I told you I would not pretend to be someone different to please a woman, that the ranch was my life, and if that was not enough, we were not meant to be together." Grant took her hand. "You made it more than enough, Theresa. You made it everything. We made it together." Theresa smiled. "That is what we have always done. Everything together." Grant pulled a small wrapped package from the basket and handed it to her. "Happy anniversary." Theresa unwrapped it to find a delicate silver locket. Inside was a photograph of their family, all 5 of them standing in front of the ranch house, everyone smiling. She clasped it around her neck with trembling fingers. "It is perfect. You are perfect." Grant leaned in to kiss her. "And I would do it all again, exactly the same way, just to end up right here with you." Theresa kissed him back, tasting 20 years of love and partnership and unwavering commitment. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling through tears. They stayed by the creek until the stars came out, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the water and remembering all the moments that had brought them to this one. The whispers that had once threatened to define Theresa had long since faded into silence, replaced by a different story. The story of a widow who found courage. The story of a cowboy who defended what was right. The story of a love that transformed 2 lonely people into a family, a partnership, a legacy. As they drove back to the ranch under the vast Texas sky, Theresa looked over at Grant's profile in the moonlight and felt nothing but gratitude. For the day he had walked into the mercantile. For the evening he had stood up to those women. For every moment since when he had chosen her, defended her, loved her. The other women had whispered behind her back, trying to destroy her with their gossip and judgment. But the cowboy had told them all to keep her name clean, and in doing so, he had changed everything. He had given her a future when she thought she had none. He had given her love when she thought she was unworthy of it. He had given her a home, a family, a reason to wake up grateful every single morning. and Theresa had given him the same gifts in return. Love that deepened with every passing year. Partnership that made the hard times bearable and the good times even better. A family they had built together, strong and healthy and full of promise. Their story was not a fairy tale. It was something better. A testament to the power of choosing love even when it is difficult, of defending someone even when it costs you, of believing that people deserve second chances and fresh starts. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest loves begin in the most unlikely places, defended by the most unlikely heroes. As they pulled up to the ranch house, now expanded and improved over the years but still fundamentally the same place where they had built their life together, Theresa could see lights glowing in the windows. Thomas had promised to watch his siblings while they had their anniversary dinner, and she could picture them inside, probably arguing over who got the last piece of pie or what game to play next. It was noisy and chaotic and imperfect, and absolutely everything she had ever wanted. Grant helped her down from the wagon, his hands gentle and familiar. "Welcome home, Mrs. Dalton." "I am home," Theresa agreed, standing on her toes to kiss him one more time. "I have been home since the day I met you." They walked inside together, hand in hand, ready to spend the rest of the evening with their children and the rest of their lives with each other. The whispers were silent now, drowned out by laughter and love and the simple joy of a life well lived. And Theresa Harper Dalton, who had once been broken and lost and certain she would never be whole again, smiled and knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged.